Polls have started closing in high-stakes US midterm elections as millions of Americans cast ballots that will shape the future of the United States of America. Polls have started to close in some parts of Indiana and Kentucky. The 2022 midterm elections are shaping up to be the most consequential in the nation's history, with the control of the Congress at stake here. All 435 seats in the House and 35 of the 100 seats in the Senate are on the ballot. Dozens of governorships, secretaries of states, attorney generals are also on the ballot. The midterm elections will also determine the future of the US President Joe Biden's agenda and test the viability of another White House run by Donald Trump. According to data from the US Election Project, more than 42 million Americans voted ahead of the election day, either by mail or in person. Meanwhile, with polls open across the country, no widespread problems with ballots, long lines or voter intimidation were reported so far. However, there were problems with dozens of electronic vote counting machines in the battleground state of Arizona. These electronic vote counting machines were seized upon by the former Republican President Donald Trump and his followers, who claimed that it was an evidence of election fraud by Democrats.
We have had problems after problems. And there's a reason we decided to change locations. We were going to go to a pretty Republican area. But I woke up this morning and within minutes of the polls opening up, I started getting people calling, voters in tears, calling my personal number, saying, what's going on? The tabulators aren't working.
And to track all the developments here and for more on this, we're being joined by our correspondent Susan Tehrani from New York, also by Voice of America correspondent Jessica Stone from Washington, D.C. And of course, joining us on this broadcast is Edward Joseph, foreign policy analyst from Washington, D.C. Thank you all of you for joining us. Susan, my first question to you, what can you tell us of the mood on ground right now?
Well, we had the first round of polls closing and a lot of excitement right now. They closed in Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky, South Carolina, Vermont, and Virginia. And one of those states, at least, Georgia, Virginia, also to an extent, is really a race of the Senate that's being closely watched. Georgia right now has new rules that mail-in ballots can be counted immediately after the polls close. And what we know so far is about 9% of the votes or so have been counted. And Raphael Warnock, the Democrat, is in the lead against Herschel Walker, the Republican. A really controversial and tight race was predicted. Now, earlier yesterday, we did talk about a red mirage or a blue mirage, so we're not holding our breath right now. But I think the mood right now is one of excitement, of anticipation, and everyone does expect a very long night, if not a week.
Of course, rightfully so. Coming to you now, Jessica, same question to you. What's the mood currently there?
Well, I think as we're looking at the exit polls that tell us what the voters are telling people, what the mood of the voters is that they're really disappointed in the current leadership. They've told the Wall Street Journal, Associated Press, and Fox News that their most important issue is inflation, which I think we're safe to say we knew that it was the economy. But overwhelmingly, they're saying inflation. And what's interesting to me as well is that above abortion and crime, which had been traditionally been in second and third place for voter concern, the future of democracy rated in this poll 4 and 10 as the single most important factor. So that's interesting because, of course, the Supreme Court's decision over the summer, where I joined you on June 24th from outside the Supreme Court to talk about that ruling, that really put a lot of wind in the sails of Democrats. But now we have seen that the economy and the weekly announcements about inflation, even though the jobs numbers are good, have definitely affected the mood of voters.
Right, absolutely, Ms. Joseph. Now, coming to you, how effective do you think the campaigns have been? And President Joe Biden, Barack Obama, former President Donald Trump, how effective do you think their campaigns have been to energize voters here?
Of course, the campaigns are very much dependent on the candidates themselves. Those are the primary actors and the primary voices, and they vary tremendously. While, as the other speakers have mentioned, there are issues that pervade the United States, concerns about inflation, about crime, about the state of democracy. The quality of candidates varies tremendously, and that affects the impact of either someone like President Biden or former President Obama, neither of whom has been very prominent on the campaign scene. Obviously, with inflation such a concern, President Biden is not seen as a figure who's likely to be a benefit to most Democrats. And it was interesting, both former President Obama and President Biden, despite whatever polling is out there that says inflation is the primary concern, both of them in the crucial closing days gave prominent speeches about the state of democracy and really pointed to that as the key issue, of a rallying point for Democrats, citing this recent terrible attack on Paul Pelosi, the husband of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. So it will be quite interesting to see in the end how voters react to that and what, in fact, drove them most to make the choices that they did today on Election Day. Please.
Right, absolutely. You're absolutely right that inflation is the top concern for voters this time. Susan, Jessica, and Mr. Edward, I'm going to have to ask you to please stay on with us. We will come back to you. Now, inflation and abortion have topped voter concerns on Election Day. The turnout has been much more impressive than anticipated. Now, it's being seen as a sign of how crucial this year's midterms have become. Let's start with inflation here. An Associated Press poll says that 8 in 10 people are voting for their economy. They feel it is in a bad state. Meanwhile, 6 in 10 voters say their vote has been impacted by the rise in petrol prices. Although these are early exit polls, money is a top concern for Americans. And this is expected to hurt the Democrats the most, because a blue government sits in the White House right now.
We've got to do something to reverse the inflationary trend that, the Democrats are spending out of control. Congress is spending out of control. That needs to come back in line.
Of course, inflation, the economy, prices are horrendous. I thought I was going to be able to retire this year, and I'm going to have to wait another year. So it's bad.
Let's go across to Kentucky, which is a blue state, but the fear of a Republican introducing restrictions on abortion rights is bringing people out to vote. Kentucky has been one of the earliest polls to close in the country, and the state counts quickly too. So we will be able to tell you in just a few hours from now which party the people chose here.
As a pro-lifer and a Democrat, I believe in life. Once a heartbeat is detected, you're taking another life. And there's medical reasons why, because that life has a totally different DNA than the mother. So I'm going to fight for the life that's in the womb, as well as lives that are out here now walking around.
Probably the number one thing is reproductive freedom. I'm looking for a full Democratic majority that will uphold Roe v. Wade, as well as candidates that will respect the results of the election.
In most states, views are divided along partisan lines. Since the January 6th Capitol riots, democracy and election authenticity have come under the scanner. The Democrats have been constantly touting these midterms as a way to save democracy. There are many other issues on the ballot as well, like gun control, immigration. Then there are other issues that flare up every election season, like education, climate, public safety. Since the 2018 election, voters have become increasingly demoralized. The political divisions in the United States have hardened. Roughly 3/4 say the country is headed in the wrong direction. That figure is higher than it was in the Vodka surveys of voters in 2018 and even 2020. Of course, for more on this, going back to Susan, Jessica and Mr. Edward Joseph from Washington, D.C. Mr. Edward, I'm coming to you first. Now, if I was just to reintroduce the statistics here to you, 8 in 10 people feel the economy is in a bad state. 44% say that democracy is at stake. 7 in 10 say Roe v. Wade has affected their voting decision. What do you make of this?
It's a mix. It's a complete mix. You pointed it out extremely well. Those are sharply contrasting interests. And some of those interests would drive a Republican wave, and some of those interests would drive a good result for Democrats today. And I think here's one of the key points for your viewers to know is we will not, in fact, very likely we will not, in fact, know the results of these elections in many of these key races for several days, even more than a week. And that's because of the preponderance of mail-in ballots. Many people may not know this. Many Americans may not even know this, but there are 8 states plus the District of Columbia that do 100% mail-in voting. Every voter in 8 states, including California, the biggest state, Utah, a major Republican state, 100% of the voters in those states get mail-in ballots. Those ballots take a long time to count. In some states like Pennsylvania, which has a crucial Senate race, maybe the closest in the country, and a key governor's race, those ballots cannot, by law, and this is a law that the Republicans have insisted upon, cannot be counted at all until the polls close. So they won't even begin to be counting all the mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania and in some other states until the closing of polls, which has not even happened across the country here in the United States, and will not happen until the latest at 1 a.m. Eastern, when the far part of Alaska finally closes today. Please.
Right. Jessica, coming to you now. As Mr. Edward Joseph mentioned, abortion and inflation, these are the top voter concerns. However, there are some voters who feel that the Democratic campaigns, they fail to address the issues of everyday issues such as cost of living crisis, inflation, and they focus more on abortion rights. How do you assess this?
I've certainly heard that argument being made several times by several different people. And I think we did see in the polling that Democrats did see a surge over the summer, as I said earlier, after Roe v. Wade was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. And that was, it really could have been a surprise turn for the Democrats to get that kind of support, that kind of polling data in an election year where they have so many seats at stake. But there has been a steady drumbeat of economic news that has not been good. And the explanations coming from the White House have been pretty technical. They've talked about GDP. Not every American knows what GDP is. They've talked about what they accomplished with the Inflation Reduction Act. And while there may be a significant amount of work in that bill, it is not clear to the American public that it is going to affect them now. They are not seeing gas prices come down immediately. They're not seeing lower prices on milk and eggs. And the tendency is always in American voting patterns to blame the party in power, and the Democrats are the party in power. So while we still do hear that women voters, and particularly white suburban women voters, are very much, and young voters are voting on the abortion issue, the reality is you have to be able to account from both parties. You're going to draw people from both parties if you run on the economy in an election year like this.
Right. Susan, now coming to you, as I mentioned earlier, the electronic vote counting machines were seized upon by the former Republican President Donald Trump and his followers in Arizona. What can you tell us about this?
People in Arizona were having problems with voting machines during this round of elections. And President Trump questioned those in the previous round, and questioning presidential elections and outcomes, the questioning of it is not against the law. What was wrong with what President Trump was doing was that he was basically making baseless claims that the elections were stolen. So this year, again, there were problems with the voting machines. Politico last night had a very widespread article about how voting machines have had problems throughout the years. And, that's something that happens every year. So the reason Arizona is making so much headline right now, again, is because of Donald Trump's, false claims about the elections being stolen. But the part about voting machines having problems, that's something that both sides of the aisle have argued that, it's something that needs to be looked into.
Mr. Joseph, now coming back to you. From what we've seen so far, of course we're waiting on the results, but from what we've seen so far, the focus somehow seems to have shifted to the 2024 presidential elections already. Now, voters don't seem to be too happy with the current state of affairs in the United States, and Donald Trump, in fact, also plans to make a very big announcement on the 15th of November. So are we witnessing some sort of a shift here?
No, I don't think so. I don't think we're witnessing a shift here. I think there's still great anticipation about the results of these elections, these midterm elections. I think there's a lot of interest, voter interest. As we see, the indicators so far that I've seen suggest that there's solid voter turnout, in some states very high voter turnout. And I don't believe that the 2024 race has overshadowed it. And in any event, President Trump certainly faces competition within the Republican Party that he did not face in 2020. And that's a major concern. It's clear that that's on Donald Trump's mind. But I don't believe that that's really where the focus is here in the United States. It's not on the presidential race. It's on this race that people do understand, regardless of what issue they say is foremost on their mind, whether it be inflation or democracy or abortion or crime. They're concerned about the state of the country right now, not 2 years from now. And again, so there'll be a lot of anticipation. That's a concern in and of itself. The anticipation is a concern. It's a political issue because we see that with Arizona. With any state where there's a delay, there will be a delay in the results, for example, in Pennsylvania. This issue can easily be politicized. Running vote totals will change. Early results will come in favoring one candidate or another. And Republicans in particular, who have been known to politicize this question, will take advantage if early vote totals suggest their candidate is winning, and then mail-in ballots come and whittle down that total. We can expect and anticipate that they will claim that this narrative, a false narrative, typically, of that they've been cheated. So that's, again, the weight itself can be political. Please.
Right, absolutely. In fact, I was just going to come to that. The delayed results, they're likely to fuel legal challenges. Like you said, they're going to politicize this issue if that does happen. And this could also spark theories about vote rigging. So how do you see the situation panning out going forward if that were to happen?
For me, it depends on the race. And it would depend on the context if there were any basis for it. Let's take this Arizona case, which was already sort of exaggerated. With the reporting that I found was that this was a modest technical glitch. It involved the printer ink, basically, or printer software. That the printing, the settings for the printers was not done properly for the ballots to be printed. And in terms of issues with machines, I think this is also largely distorted. In many cases, in fact, going back to Russian interference, there's been a move in the states to go backwards on technology. That is to rely on paper ballots that ensure that there's a physical paper auditable trail. I myself voted today in my state of Maryland, and there's a physical piece of paper is your ballot, going back to technology basically from the 1960s. So I don't really think that there's a big issue here with machines and glitches and things like that. There's much lower reliance on technology than before. This is by design, and in fact, I think bipartisan, again, right, stemming initially from fears of Russian interference. So again, we have to see how the process goes forward and how candidates themselves react to fluctuating vote totals as we learn them. Please.
Right, absolutely. Also, sir, if I could just ask you, of course, this is happening in the backdrop of the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, from what we've seen, a lot of Republicans are not in favor of the kind of aid that has been going to Ukraine. And we know that the Biden administration's policies hang in the balance with this election. So how do you assess the fallout of a strong Republican showing here?
Well, in my view, there's some basis for concern. I don't think there's a need for alarm. But if, let's say, Republicans do take control of the House of Representatives and possibly the Senate, I think there's a cause for concern, but I wouldn't say alarm. There's a split within the Republican Party on this issue. You have traditionally, you have your Republican national security conservatives, and they will and have been very vocal in terms of their support for Ukraine in this fight. And then, of course, you have the number of Trump-influenced candidates, and some of them prominent. Some of them are Senate candidates who may well win. And also we have the presumptive House Speaker, Paul McCarthy, if Republicans take the House, who has said that Ukraine will not get a blank check. So there could be a change in tone, but there will be a split, very likely, within the Republican Party on this issue, with a number of prominent Republicans still standing with Democrats very strongly in support of Ukraine and against Russia for its unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Please.
All right. All right, Mr. Edward Joseph, Susan Tehrani, and Jessica Stone, thank you all of you for joining us on this broadcast with your insights on this.